Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my guest, Mike Walsh with Groundwork Data, and everyone joining today at MassCEC and beyond. This is our fourth edition of this MassCEC speaker series, in which we're highlighting experts, pioneers, and practitioners from a variety of existing and emerging climate tech sectors and disciplines, as well as subject matter experts who can provide insights into broader economic, social, and technological dynamics shaping our industry. So today we're going to talk about neighborhood electrification. I'm really happy to welcome you, Mike, and your firm, Groundwork Data. You've done a lot of work in this space, including for us here at MassCEC and for our colleagues at DOER. But before we jump to Mike, as I do each and every time we hold this series, I'm going to set the table for our discussion today briefly. There are a number of factors that have driven interest in neighborhood scale electrification. Mike's going to dive into a few more, but I wanted to just highlight a couple that I think are particularly noteworthy. First, as many listeners to this series are aware, Massachusetts and other leading climate states have adopted an electrify everything approach to meeting our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. And in the built environment, particularly existing buildings, present enormous challenges in this regard, but also opportunities for electrification as air source heat pumps, and to a lesser extent, ground source heat pumps gain market traction, driven by consumer interest in cooling, generous mass save incentives, and a gradual recognition of the performance and efficiency benefits of heat pumps. But left to market forces and equipment turnover rates, will continue to need to maintain two large, expensive energy delivery systems in the state, of course, our gas distribution network of pipes and our electric grid. And complicating matters here in the Northeast are substantial portions of the 21,000 miles or so of gas pipelines that serve our homes and businesses. Many of them are old and leaky. The state created the GSEP, or Gas System Enhancement Plan structure, to enable the gas utilities to accelerate replacement of leaky pipes. This work is necessary, of course, but it's also quite expensive. So years ago, the state of Massachusetts and other states began to explore this question. Rather than passively observing a slow and steady but geographically random transition to building electrification, what if the utilities, working in close partnership with customers, with communities, were to target electrification at the neighborhood scale? Could some of those GSEP investment dollars and related costs be avoided? Where might shared systems like the networked geothermal project that's now up and running in Eversource territory in Framingham make sense? Where might individual building solutions be a better fit? How would such neighborhood electrification efforts impact the local distribution grid? So we started to ask ourselves many of these questions, and then we were delighted when we crossed paths with Mike, because not only had he begun to think about these questions, but Mike, in fact, you had begun to develop a tool that could help utilities, communities, and regulators think strategically about neighborhood electrification. So that's the high-level overview, and I know Mike's going to provide some more. So let's start with some basics, Mike. How did we get here? Even stepping back before we get into neighborhood electrification, how and why did the natural gas consumption, how has that expanded? How and why has it expanded so dramatically over the last 20 years? And looking ahead, what technology and macroeconomic forces do you anticipate will impact gas customers over the next 10 to 20 years? And thanks again for joining.
Yeah. Well, first, Galen, thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here today. It's a great way to kind of finish up a busy month before we, I have 3 young kids. I'm about to head off on vacation next week. So excited to take today to talk with this group. I'm really glad that you assembled this sort of group of I think, really Bright and talented people in this space. I'm looking down some of the names of the attendee list, and really excited to share some of our thoughts and lessons from these exercises with this group today. And again, thank you to the folks at the state for being helpful collaborators, both in DOER and at MassCEC, on some of this work over the past number of years. These are very challenging, problems to have, particularly here in a place like Massachusetts, our cold climate, our old building stock, our old gas system. But it's really great to see a state like Massachusetts really try to take the lead on a lot of this stuff. So going now to this question of how do we get there? How did we get here to this point? I'm going to bring up a slide for a minute and talk about history. I think, Galen, you asked, like, how did we sort of, what has the past 20 or so years looked like in gas? And I think it's even helpful to go back a little bit before then. Prior to about 2005, gas and oil in the Northeast were relatively the same price. We actually had a very expensive gas system. A lot of customers were relatively happy on oil and didn't necessarily see a need to change. But starting around 2005, the market dynamics, tended to shift pretty dramatically in favor of gas. And I would say not only the market dynamics, but the social objectives and the policy objectives around energy and heating and what fuels to heat with. And during that time, we saw the emergence of hydraulic fracturing technology and directional drilling, which unlocked cheap gas in areas such as New York, in Pennsylvania, and elsewhere across the United States, that really turned the U.S. into a powerhouse in producing like low-cost, cheap gas supply. Around the same time, we have a very old gas system here in the Northeast, and built out over a century ago in many locations. And since then, there actually hadn't been a lot of investment made into it. And before GSEP, which is the program that you mentioned earlier, this sort of gas safety enhancement plan effort to modernize the gas system, utilities weren't spending a huge chunk of change on the gas system, keeping costs relatively low so they could compete and bring in new customers from oil. Then around the same time, you started to see a couple of things happening. Gas companies started to market more and encourage more steady growth in customers, which led to the averaging or the distribution of costs across a large customer base, leading to lower average cost per customer. At the same time, climate concerns started, popping up, and gas was considered a bridge fuel for moving customers off of more carbon-intensive oil. Gas was the only option at that time for delivering greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and so policymakers adopted it as a strategy to drive forward on their climate goals back then. And again, during that time, gas was seen as sort of the premium product. It was easy to hook up to. You had it directly going into your home. You didn't have to worry about your tank getting refilled. And people liked cooking with gas during that period. It was considered sort of the premium cooking fuel or the premium cooking source at that time. Fast forward to today, or really after 2020 is really when this pivot evolved. Supply remains historically cheap, again, due to fracking, but we now have a more global gas market because of LNG exports in the United States. We built up more LNG export terminals. We're also looking forward to the future and seeing a lot of demand on that gas supply, pushing up costs, and that demand's largely coming from data centers. Right now, gas rates are steadily increasing due to cumulative investment needs. There's about $15 billion in pending capital investment in the GSEP program right now that will be spent over the course of the next 15 or so years. That's another big dig here in Massachusetts, and it's very concerning that we're spending that level of money when we're talking about phasing out gas and moving beyond gas in the Commonwealth. We are seeing lower growth and declining consumption. As new customers hook up, they are more efficient, and that's leading to a concentration of system costs on a shrinking customer base. On the climate front, we are shifting into high gear now and trying to move as fast as we can on climate, and that means taking advantage of electrification as a heating strategy and moving beyond the combustion of fuels on site. And finally, this new technology out there, whether it be the modularity, the heat pumps like I have in the right behind me, or the fast, powerful cooking of induction stove, that leads to distinct value propositions that are encouraging more customers to shift over to those electric technologies. And so what this spells out going forward is right now we have these three converging disruptors of the gas system. First off is that system cost, aging pipeline, that $15 billion needed over the course of the next couple decades, driving up the cost of the gas system overall. At the same time, climate policy is shifting customers away, shifting demand down, and competition from new fuel sources is driving forward gas demand. Sorry, driving forward customers to move off of gas. I apologize. It is a school day. My daughter is showing up to say hi. But back to the COVID days. But to really sum this up, what's happening is we have a growing cost of the gas system being concentrated on a declining customer base and declining consumption, driving up gas rates over the course of time. And this is a big concern for us going forward. Galen, can you just stall for a second?
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think that was a really helpful overview that that Mike provided. We're going to pivot now to talk a little bit about some of the steps that the state has taken, the state of Massachusetts has taken to set us up for progress in this area. So in no particular order, beginning with the DPU's Future of Gas docket 2080, that of course set forth, put forth a new agenda and perspective on a slow but steady move away from gas. So I suspect that Mike will jump in on that a little bit more. That included permitting the utilities, the investor-owned utilities, to move forward with some networked geothermal pilots. I mentioned the Eversource networked geothermal pilot in Framingham earlier. And then hot off the presses, the utilities have released their, the gas utilities have released their CCPs, or climate compliance plans. So those are some of the relevant regulatory frameworks, the ways in which the Commonwealth has begun to try to advance a neighborhood electrification and move us toward a more strategic approach with regard to moving away from gas. But perhaps, Mike, you can weigh in a little bit more on the kind of the relevant regulatory frameworks.
Yeah, thank you, Galen, and apologies for that, everybody. We get the grandparents over today watching the kids, and they're not used to watching all of them all at once. But I think, just to highlight, again, just going back to the slide that I previously showed, this concern about rising cost, and particularly those rising costs being concentrated on a customer base that is less able and less capable of moving beyond gas. It really has prompted states such as Massachusetts and regulators such as our Department of Public Utilities to take a look at more steps to managing this transition and avoiding sort of an unmanaged exodus of customers from the gas system. And what this involves, and Galen alluded to some of this a moment ago, are enacting new rules for utility investments and cost recovery. And so this is the whole point of the concept of non-pipeline or non-gas alternatives. So when a company needs to invest in the gas system, whether it's replace a pipe or deal with a reliability concern in part of it, they need to now look at strategies for that are not those large traditional investments. And those strategies could include moving customers beyond gas and moving a certain set of customers beyond gas, such as those in a whole neighborhood if you're trying to avoid replacing a leak-prone pipe. And what that also needs to kind of drive actions like that forward, we need more coordinated decision making by policymakers and utilities, a really more engaged and sort of proactive approach to utility planning across both the gas and electric sectors that we haven't seen in the past. Historically, there's been some regulation, but utilities are left to their own devices in terms of infrastructure planning and investments. That is oftentimes checked by the regulator. But now, as we're talking about trying to strategically, make decisions across both the gas and electric sectors, as well as really trying to integrate sort of what resources that we may have to decarbonize, such as thermal resources to support thermal networks, or really large-scale efforts to improve the building stock, that requires more coordination. And then what some of that coordination may involve is more support from the ground up. particularly at the municipal level. I think here in Massachusetts, we have this great tradition of municipal leadership. One example of that is a 10 fossil fuel-free community pilot program being run by DOER right now, in which those pilot communities are advancing sort of a net zero building energy code at the time. How can we take that framework and apply it now to the gas transition? Is really sort of the crux of really trying to take a more active and proactive approach to asking where are the opportunities to move beyond gas, in a cost-effective and strategic way.
Yeah, and I'm glad you called that out, Mike, because it's of course worth underscoring that once you start talking about electrifying more than one building, by definition, you're beginning to talk about a community and engagement with town or municipal leadership, and you're starting to impact multiple households, potentially businesses, and there are planning implications and impacts on communities. So I'm glad you mentioned that. In addition to 2080, acknowledging that existing buildings are our greatest challenge, I suppose it's also worth briefly hovering on new construction where, and again, thinking about DOER on the regulatory side and the stretch code that, I mean, my understanding is that now it's going to make a lot more sense for new construction to move forward without gas, in the absence of gas. So I guess at least on the new construction side, would you also agree that's a driver?
Oh, certainly. And right now it's actually a very much under consideration in this sort of managed gas context. Within that sort of future of gas investigation, the DPU docket 2080, the DPU actually looked into or is looking into revising its policy around line extension allowances. And so in the past, to encourage customer growth, utilities were allowed to grant new customers access to the system and cover part of the cost of connecting some of those customers to the system, with the assumption that those customers would pay off that cost over time. And that strategy worked under a growing system, but as we're shifting to a system that is in decline, which now different types of customers coming onto the system in that are more efficient, use less gas. They may have sort of just use gas in a backup arrangement. That creates a lot more uncertainty about those future costs being recovered, being paid back by those customers. And so the department is looking into strategies to help manage that by revising that line extension allowance policy.
That makes sense. I mean, I think part of what is really interesting about this challenge is that it's so multifaceted and involves really multivariate. I mean, it involves simultaneous consideration of both gas, and you mentioned this briefly, but gas and electric distribution infrastructure, right? If you begin to electrify a neighborhood that was relying in part on gas for space and or water heating and cooking, of course, you're going to impact the grid. And this involves and requires greater coordination between the electric and gas utilities. So I just think that's kind of an interesting component of this aspect of the transition. Assuming a gas utility is incentivized now to explore NPAs, and they are under 2080, what are some of the variables that must be considered that inform, and I think this is beginning to get into the kind of the core of your work, but that inform how and where a gas utility might begin to prune, as it were, its existing gas network to facilitate a transition to building electrification? I mean, how would a utility kind of optimize for cost while, and important to underscore, right? The gas utility needs to maintain a safe and reliable system. Mm-hmm. And you can't just shut off willy-nilly certain parts of the gas distribution system without potentially incurring negative impact. So I know that you and your team have thought a lot about this. So it would be great, I guess, and you conducted a study along these lines with DOER that I think is excellent. So it'd be wonderful if you could just begin to kind of get us into that study a little bit. What are some of the scenarios that you looked at? You looked at a couple different street segments, I believe, and I think it would just be great to kind of get into the mind of your utility. How do you think? What are all the different things you need to consider as you begin to think about neighborhood electrification?
Yeah, thanks, Galen, for highlighting that work. It really helped us to set the stage for thinking about this problem. I think I'll just start off by bringing up an example here, not too far from where I live, but this is a dead end street. So you asked about where can you do this in a way that's not willy-nilly, that won't impact other gas customers that are out there. And dead end streets are pretty clear logical place to start if you're talking about this question of pruning the gas system, because it really won't affect demand or affect any other customers beyond those on the street. So this is a street not too far from where I live in Arlington. It has been identified in this year's Gas Safety Enhancement Plan, or GSEP for National Grid. And they identified it as a potential non-pipeline alternative. And the reason why it's in the GSEP plan was, well, it is a century-old part of the gas system, cast iron pipe. There was a leak that popped up here a couple of years ago, which bumped it up as a sort of a more riskier pipe that they wanted to watch out for. And so they put it into this year's gas safety enhancement plan. But it's a street that only has 7 homes. But the whole project cost for replacing the gas pipeline on the street is almost $500,000, or approaching about $70,000 per home. And there's going to be a lot of elements that really go into making a decision around that. But this is a really big, I think, standout example of what you could consider something that is easy to quote unquote prune from the gas system. Again, it's it's a branch, it's a dead end branch, and it has sort of a high cost per customer to replace that gas pipeline. There's some concern about not being able to implement that MPA in the near term, given the risky nature of this pipe. And so it's trying to balance really an understanding of, well, where are the opportunities are to kind of move customers, beyond gas when you're factoring in the operation of the gas system, which is not only just, whether it's some major part of the gas pipe, you can't take that out. You got to, target areas such as this, which are more the tendrils, the branches of the gas system. Where there are leaks. I mean, if there's a lot of leaky pipe on a street like this, there might be an urgent need to replace it. And you might not be able to implement a target electrification project on this street. But we do know that just going down there and talking to a couple of the neighbors, that at least 2 people are interested in sort of renovating their homes and potentially moving beyond gas in the next couple of years. And that's going to bump that average cost per customer up. So to really summarize, I think some of the key issues that we're looking at here, it's this question of, can you prune this off of the gas system? And that's a big chunk of the study that we're doing right now for MassCEC and in partnership with folks over at DOER as well. But also, what's the cost effectiveness of it? This does appear to be a more more of a larger opportunity from a cost effective standpoint. And then finally, too, what are the impacts to the grid, as you mentioned? And fortunately, in our space right now in the Northeast, we are a summer peaking grid. Right now, most of these homes are using more electricity in the summer for cooling. And so there's plenty of headroom on the grid in a lot of these locations right now, that if you electrify streets, at least in the near term, that there's plenty of headroom on the grid, so you can add in this case, about 7 homes without too much problem. You might have to add a sort of distribution scale transformer or 2 to 1 or 2 of these poles just to upgrade, what is available on the street. But the local electricity supply, feeder from the substation into here should have plenty of headroom given all that. But it's integrating those sort of 3 elements of the operations of the gas system, the operations of the electric system, and really sort of the cost effectiveness, which depends upon both the gas and electric system, but as well as what is needed to get the building stock to move beyond gas.
And so this might be another advantage of in addition to little traffic, of living on a dead end street, is that maybe you're a good candidate for neighborhood electrification.
It might be, but I want to emphasize that it's not just limited to dead end streets. So we're building out some of the models of the gas system right now, and actually seeing that the opportunities for pruning the gas system are much larger than you would think out there. And
another observation on this, and just and I'm just speculating here, but looking at the housing stock, I'm sensing 1950s or more recent, right?
Yeah.
So these building envelopes probably are moderately higher performers than last century um, built structures, and therefore might also be better candidates for heat pump installation, or would require less weatherization, perhaps. So just noting that there are a number of different factors um, when kind of thinking about this transition. Um, so what are some of the data sets? Let's talk a little bit about because you mentioned the cast iron pipe. Um, we just talked about the kind of age, vintage, and condition of the building stock. You need to understand the kind of condition and the capacity of the electric grid. What are the various data sets that neighborhood electrification practitioners, including, of course, utilities, that they need at hand, and that you do as an analyst, that you need to identify these hotspots, if you will, these opportunity locations, and what are the challenges related to each of those data sets?
Yeah. Well, I think the ideal situation is, you're a utility and you might have access to some of these data. We don't. We're actually, as part of our work right now, we're exploring avenues and the assumptions that you can make without access to the data that a utility has, and seeing how much demonstration of this type of integrated energy planning that you can do without access to some of that data. We are talking with the utilities right now about certain data needs in some of these cases. In terms of the electric system, it's really helpful to know the state and the age and the capacity of those transformers and those wires leading to those homes. I will note that our utilities, or electric utilities in the state, do publish hosting capacity maps for the solar industry. So solar project developers can identify, well, where are the key opportunities for deploying solar um, in parts of the system, because there are some parts of the system that are getting overloaded with solar right now. And so that is a helpful resource for those project developers there. On the gas side, this tends to be a little bit more challenging. It's having that map of the gas system, which includes sort of the age of the pipe, the risk of the pipe, the type of the pipe, the connections that pipe has. And utilities hold that data pretty close to home on that. They call it critical energy infrastructure data, and they're not typically used to sharing that data out there. But there are some assumptions that we can make in the absence of that, and you can go down a street and oftentimes look for those gas markings and find out, okay, is there a cast iron pipe under the street here? How big is it? And within some of the work that we're doing right now, we're actually on Google Maps, doing some spot checking on some of the assumptions that we make to get those bits and pieces of information. On the building side, I mean, every building is its own, special thing. It's its own unique thing, and has its own unique challenges. And you can even get a sense of the energy use in a building, but not have a sense of how the person living in that building is interacting with that building, driving a certain energy load that you may have. Um, and so, having some information around the type of the building stock that exists out there is helpful. There is some data available from the state, from municipalities, on the age, on the type of buildings that help us to understand understand what the characteristics of the building stock are. Some of the great researchers at the national labs have published extensive data sets on the energy use of different types of buildings. Are they always accurate? Never. Are they useful? Sometimes. And so we're trying to integrate that as well, as we go along this process here. And ultimately, it's helpful to know if what has been done to the building as well. And so if there's any sort of mass save, incentive data that's been delivered, we've actually used some of the stuff that MassCEC has tracked in some of our earlier work for information. The utilities have access to some of that data, but one of the barriers that they've had to face over the course of the last year is there's been some obscure parts of Massachusetts consumer protection law that have prevented the electric utility and the gas utility, even though they're owned by the same corporate parent, from sharing data amongst them. And the DPU had to grant a waiver. on that front. So we're doing a lot of experimentation as we go along, trying to figure out what data sets work well and what data sets we need to really dive in on and see if we can refine some of our assumptions or grab some more data. But just really have a strong understanding of the gas system, the building system, the electric system are really essential to this work.
Thanks, Mike. No, I think it's helpful for folks to know, what data are required in order for us to move forward. So let's dig into a little bit about what you found in the name of the study, the thermal transition study. My understanding is that you looked at a few different street segments. So maybe you could kind of just briefly describe what those like kind of typical street segments. And then you also looked at a number of scenarios, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think we have time, and frankly, our listeners probably don't have the appetite to get into all of them, but I know you looked at kind of a business as usual scenario, a full electrification, an electrification, kind of a hybrid approach with a kind of a gas backup. So I'm wondering if you could just maybe pick maybe, 1 to 3 of the more, well, at least two, I suppose, of the more interesting scenario analyses and kind of walk us through, what you found as far as impacts on both individual homeowner and overall ratepayer costs and emissions outcomes.
Yeah. I'm going to actually flip us up a slide here to hopefully help us through this conversation and ask the audience or recommend to the audience to just ignore a lot of the text and numbers on here and just focus on the fact that we have pretty colors. So we looked at 5 different scenarios, 3 of which were under this assumption of the gas pipeline being replaced. We looked at, actually, I should take a step back, is we looked at a single family street that was undergoing a GSEP replacement project and a multifamily street that was going under a GSEP replacement project, just to really get a sense of 2 really typical places across the Commonwealth, or situations in which you might want to try to understand, well, what are the options available here and what are the trade-offs at play. And on the single family street, we looked at 3 scenarios if the gas pipeline was being replaced: continued gas as usual, doing a hybrid approach, dual fuel, keeping that pipeline, but also installing some air source heat pumps, and then replacing that pipeline, but then steadily doing an unmanaged electrification on that street. So letting the homes electrify one by one over the course of the next 25 years. And in that situation, what you're having is you're basically, shoveling money both into the ground and spending a lot of money in the home on electrification. And that actually resulted in that scenario being the highest cost, so the red here, amongst all the scenarios that we looked at. I would say the highest capital investment up front. Then we took a look at scenarios around, well, what if you end that gas service in 2025 did the infrastructure investments on the building and then the grid side, taking a look at electrifying all those buildings all at once, or giving a little bit more flexibility by allowing some customers to have a propane tank if they really wanted to have some backup and heating source, or still use gas for cooking. And what we found is those scenarios, again, because you're avoiding that large chunk of cost on the pipeline replacement, ended up being some of your more economically favorable scenarios here. And they also ended up being more aligned with some of our climate goals overall. And so just to emphasize, a key takeaway from this is when you're replacing the gas pipeline, you're shoveling money into the ground with the risk of that money being stranded there, that asset being stranded there in the long term, as customers steadily electrify, if you assume that that's going to happen. If you avoid that and try to move some of that cost up front, you tend to achieve your goals earlier and potentially save costs as well. I'll note that these numbers here we're refining them as we go along in this sort of more updated study. We're going to be tweaking them, I think, over the course of the next couple months, to really update them for a broader perspective on things. And I think overall, a lot we also wanted to emphasize in this, this shows upfront capital costs. It doesn't say anything about customer utility bills. And with this study, we also wanted to emphasize, well, that depends on a lot of what ifs about the future. And we're seeing the state right now advance in partnership with the utilities policies that will make heating and electrification cheaper, such as heat pump friendly rates as well. So just want to emphasize that there's a lot of dials to be turned here and there, a lot of different scenarios that we could model out. But at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is, are you shoveling money in the ground, or are you investing that money into the building stock and trying to deliver value through improved buildings that are there? And mapping all that out is challenging, but this is what this exercise is about, is really trying to map out, okay, where's money being spent, where's value being created, with both the near term and the long term perspective.
Thanks, Mike. This is really important. And I want to underscore that this, and you've said this too, but this is a really tough challenge. And I think it's wonderful to see so many different market actors and critical stakeholders coming together to really work this problem, from the utilities to the regulators, the DPU community. So I do want to underscore this is a tough challenge. At the same time, I think what your data show, right, at least again on the upfront capital side, is that the kind of business as usual approach, which will extend the life of two expensive systems, is absolutely the most costly, which is why I think it's so encouraging that the state at the DPU is moving forward with 2080, that the pilots were approved, and that there's ongoing dialogue about how to move this agenda, if you will, forward, because we know that not only do we need to electrify from a climate perspective, but now we also know from a cost perspective that an unmanaged electrification is not the most prudent path forward. So maybe we could talk a little bit about next steps. I know that other states are exploring this approach. I think I first heard about, and it was called their tactical decommissioning of the gas system in California. There was a proceeding there, and other states are looking at this. So, what do you think we can learn from those states? Are there regulatory or programmatic or market transition efforts in other states that you think are worth digging into a bit more?
Yeah, first off, I want to emphasize that I think some of these states are actually learning from us, by some of the leading, cutting edge thinking that we're doing out here. That MassCEC has pioneered on building electrification and all that our utility MassCEC programs have really driven forward. And I think what we've seen, however, is two states, California and Colorado specifically, jump ahead in terms of offering some clarifying language around, or clarifying legislation around how to drive forward targeted neighborhood scale electrification. And in both of those states, and it gets pretty wonky in terms of legal topics. I'm going to invoke this term, the obligation to serve here, which is this concept that customers, particularly once they're granted access to the system, are guaranteed access to the system in a non-discriminatory way. And so you can't just willy-nilly.
Part of the franchise, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. And you just can't willy-nilly cut customers off. There are some rules of you can do that if they're not paying their bills, etc. But customers are given the expectation that they have service in the long term. We're concerned about what that sort of framework means as we talk about this system under transition, and that's another discussion. But both
Although
these,
there, Mike, just briefly to hover
yeah.
on that, of course, one of the proposed concept there is might that pivot to kind of an obligation to serve thermal energy as opposed to gas?
Yeah, and I think what it's interesting looking at some of the Massachusetts history around the obligation to serve. There's a Supreme Court case back in Supreme Judicial Court case of Massachusetts, from the early 1900s on utility shifting around customers at that time, particularly as customers went from one electric system to another, and they were just organizing their territories at that time and consolidating. But just on that point, Massachusetts has made an advance, in terms of allowing some utilities to now shift customers from gas to a thermal service as an option. And that is, a step in that direction of really trying to imagine, like, well, what are customers guaranteed, and how what tools can we use to make sure that they're sort of guaranteed service and given due regard, and ideally left better off by a transition. And then I think that's the principle that we want to establish and make sure is at the heart of everything that we're trying to do, is ensuring that whatever transition that customers are being moved forward on leaves them better off and provides them with sort of a better value in their homes, reliable service, and reliable service, reliable buildings, etc. And I think that sort of expansion of the obligation to serve in Massachusetts, heads in, to thermal services, heads in that direction.
Can you think of, I mean, are there parallels from other sectors? I tend to think of, and again, just for listeners, because we did gloss over this a little bit, so I want to make sure that everyone understands that the investor-owned utilities were granted essentially a monopoly to serve certain components of the state, and in exchange for that, they have an obligation to serve. So they, I think, very reasonably are concerned about efforts that might force customers to pick one type of energy delivery service over another, and they've raised very legitimate concerns about that. But are there other transitions? I tend to think, for example, about the move from septic to sewer systems as one example. But can we look to other technologies or sectors where we've seen kind of successful transitions that might involve some of these same tensions with one utility franchise, but also the real issues of customer choice and just change is tough sometimes.
I hate to say it because I love trains, but back in the day, 150 years ago, trains, railroads were regulated as utilities, and customers were guaranteed a railroad service back in the day, until it just became too cost ineffective for those railroad services to provide service, and they were allowed to basically halt service in some locations. And so you have that. We certainly are seeing this in California right now, as with rapid rise in solar and storage and distributed energy resources, and customers moving beyond being fully dependent to partially dependent, in some cases independent, on the electric grid, and that raises a lot of concerns for that in California. And I use these two examples to emphasize a key point. That requires us to take a more proactive approach to management here. Is the gas system is facing unprecedented competition. Again, just going back to my earlier slide, there was this expectation that gas was it. It was the future fuel, and that future was here forever. We are now in the space where our customers have a number of options, and those options align with decarbonization goals. And so we can anticipate that customers will move beyond gas to some degree on their own accord, but that's going to create challenges for the utility and for the remaining customers on the system that need to be kind of factored into the equation of a prudent regulation and prudent management of the system going forward. And so we oftentimes, because we've done all these pathway studies, and I know I'm partly responsible for that, frame things or see things as a choice between, pathway A or pathway B. In fact, we're undergoing a technological transformation, some of which is being driven by policy choices, but some of which is being driven on its own. And that just requires more regulatory involvement and regulatory management, and just rethinking and adapting some of these paradigms, such as the obligation to serve, to the modern era.
So maybe that's and I want to make sure that we have time. There are a few audience questions, but maybe just to hover on this last point before we pivot to that. We just talked about obligation to serve. So that might be one area where the state, so thinking about what steps should we be taking next here in the Commonwealth. And thank you for reminding folks that, and it's wonderful to hear that folks are also looking to us for our leadership. That doesn't surprise me in this regard. But what are some additional steps that we might want to take next? We need more pilots. This obligation to serve issue, it sounds like perhaps there's a regulatory solution there. Do you see other kind of regulatory or other challenges that we need to overcome, or other steps that you think we should take in the short term to continue to move the ball forward on neighborhood electrification here in Mass?
Yeah. I think firstly I want to mention and the pilots that our utilities are underway, both the thermal energy network pilots and the sort of building scale target electrification pilots. National Grid has proposed 2 pilots in Leominster or a set of pilots in have identified a number of potential opportunities in Leominster and Winthrop for their pilots, and are looking at really trying to find streets to basically sign up and volunteer to be, the early adopters in this concept and in this project. And the design of their pilots is, and there's a lot of debate going on around it, but they're going to pay for everything the customer may need. That includes some barrier mitigation, involved in that. And the question that they're trying to ask is, what are the barriers that may exist, even if they remove the economic barrier? Is it a social barrier? Is it that one person at the end of the street saying, no, 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 still want my gas around? And that's, the key challenge here that everyone's trying to really grapple with is, what if you do get to that street where you have 10 customers, 9 of whom want to move beyond gas, but you have one customer who says, I want to keep gas around. And National Grid believes, or I would say the state's LDCs believe right now, gas companies believe right now, that they have an obligation to kind of replace that gas pipeline if that one gas customer wants to do that. I think that would be a scandal if that unfolds, and that would raise a lot of concerns and alarm bells should raise a lot of concerns and alarm bells for ratepayers. We talked about what some of the other states have done to leapfrog Massachusetts on this front, and I will cite, for example, Colorado, which I think has taken a really helpful and innovative approach here by proposing sort of municipal scale, community-driven pilots, programs in which a municipality and a gas utility work together to identify a street. And if they can get enough customers, about what they call a reasonable majority to be determined by the town, that they can move forward with that pilot and again try to find opportunities and options to move some resistant customers beyond gas. Maybe that's a propane tank, and so they can keep their gas stove. But the idea is you get the communities and the utilities working together on this, and I think there's a lot of value in that, particularly in places like Winthrop, which is facing a number of questions around the impacts of climate. And one of the reasons why National Grid is targeting Winthrop and looking at that is because they're concerned about gas equipment in basements that might be flooded. And if you move the heating equipment to a bunch of air source heat pumps on pads outside of the, above ground, you might be able to add some resiliency benefits there as well. So it's really trying to find, the opportunities that may play out at the community level, that I think Massachusetts could emulate. Again, we have a great framework with DOE's, 10 communities pilot laid out there. And I think we have some willing utilities here as well that are really interested in taking that community-driven approach and trying to see where they can go with it.
Thanks, Mike. That's helpful. I mean, this is probably a good segue to at least the first question I'm seeing here, and I think you've addressed a good deal of this. I mean, we've talked about the challenges, primarily the financial challenges of maintaining 2 expensive energy delivery systems in the gas and the electric grid, and this notion that perhaps for some homes, whether it's for resilience purposes, or maybe it's homeowner preference, whatever that might be, that having perhaps some propane backup, makes more sense. It also does occur to me that it's somewhat tangential, but the gas system itself is not without risk. Of course, we hear a lot more about electric grid outages and performance challenges in the Northeast, often caused by extreme weather. But the gas system itself is dependent on increasingly the electric grid to maintain pressure. So, the gas system is not without its own challenges. So just thinking about resilience, it does seem as though perhaps for some customers, having a delivered fuel stored, again, perhaps it's propane, might be a good option. And it sounds like that was one of the scenarios that you looked at.
Yeah, and it did, and it just it helped to solve a couple of problems. It helped to solve two key problems here. The first of which being customer choice. There might be some customers who still want to have their gas stove or still want to have some backup. And that could be, we think about this and we do a lot of our work focused on the residential sector because it's easy to grapple with, but that could be a restaurant, that could be a larger commercial entity that might have found a way to, to reduce its demand for a good chunk of the year, but just the expense of building a fully sized electrification, fully electric heating system is just too much. And so having some on-site backup fuel for that heating purposes, for that heating need may be an effective way to move that building, be off of gas. I do want to emphasize too that there are parts of the gas system that are okay, and they'll still be in place probably in 25 years, and that might still play a role in providing some backup heat, but probably at a limited size. What we're talking about here are opportunities to avoid reinvestment in the gas system, avoiding that leak-prone pipe replacement. And we think, and we wanted to demonstrate and illustrate that using some delivered fuels helps to get over some customer choice issues, but it also helps to get over some barrier issues that are there. One other thing to note on this front too is as the cost of gas goes up, the economics of, for those reasons I illustrated earlier, the economics of delivered fuels become more advantageous. And so you could imagine a customer in the future saying, this gas, connection is just too expensive. I'm going to go off and do, delivered fuels, because it's cheaper. And ideally they partially electrify. So again, there are sort of these market in competition dynamics, at play there. And so, really just trying to think about that and really identify opportunities for that is I think an important part of our research and these plans going forward. Ideally, we're burning a lot less in the future, though.
And it's one can imagine that these would in many cases be largely peaking resources, right? So maybe it's backup heat, or maybe there's a little bit of cooking, but we're not talking about enormous fossil fuel use. And perhaps there also might be places on the system where rural areas where the cost of beefing up the electric grid is much higher per customer. I know that those costs are socialized across the entire rate base, but just thinking about where this would make more sense, perhaps there are more optimal locations on the system where those hybrid approaches again are more prudent than others. There is I think a question here that I think is fairly straightforward, but I think it's good for people to understand. To be clear, the networked geothermal pilots, those were approved by the DPU, and those costs were spread across the entire rate base. So just confirming that the answer to that question is yes. Those were not limited to the customers that the costs related to those projects were not limited to the customers that participated in that. Another listener has an interesting question, or I guess flagging a research effort, which I'm not familiar with, but assuming this is accurate, a research effort looking into what motivates customers to electrify or not. And the question, should Massachusetts do the same to identify the barriers for electrification? I think it's an interesting notion. I don't know if we've looked at that here at MassCEC, and I haven't dug into this space too much, but I suppose it would be helpful to better understand the kind of barriers or concerns that folks might have.
Yeah, I think I would point to MassSave. I mean, they've done substantial research on trying to understand what customers just participate or don't participate in MassSave overall. And what you see actually is a couple things. You see, I think it is well understood that higher income, customers, are more likely to be proactive. They have more access to information. They sort of, are able to kind of buy into that Mass Save program a little bit more. But you also see at the low income level programs such as and I'm blanking on the name, but our community action agencies across the state, LEAN, low energy action network, low income energy action network or something. Too many acronyms these days. Do a great job in coordinating projects, particularly for mid-size and larger multifamily low income housing. And I think it's that coordination that we want to point to as great examples for learning from as we try to deploy targeted neighborhood scale electrification. How do you engage with multiple customers at the same time? It's something that they have learned how to do, particularly in some of those larger buildings as well. And just kind of circling back, I do think we need to be more tuned to this and continue the research. I would actually love if the listener here could just send a link to that to us, so I'm a little bit more familiar with
Great.
the design of that information. But the other thing that I want to be clear about is we know a lot of folks are just concerned about the cost, and we need to be very aggressive about keeping the cost of electric heating relatively low. And I think I talked about it earlier. The heat pump friendly electric rates that are being rolled out right now are a great step forward in that direction. But we also need to be prudent about where we're investing in our electric infrastructure and how we're doing that going forward to keep the cost. We're going to be making a lot of investment in that. It's needed to keep up with demand because people do want electric vehicles. People do want heating electrification that is going to be driven forward. We are going to have to make some investments to modernize too for resiliency. Being smart about that spending is pretty essential so we can ensure that we keep electric costs low.
Thanks, Mike. Someone else asked if we would let the audience know about relevant DPU dockets or opportunities for engagement. Of course, the answer is 2080. I won't try and pull up at the site now, but I believe there is a kind of a dockets search page or room where you can literally enter 20-80 and you'll be able to find relevant documentation there at the Department of Public Utilities website. And I suspect there'll be information about, if any, upcoming events, hearings, documents, and so on. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Mike.
I think that covers it. I mean, I have just, the last around the new year created a master spreadsheet tracking all these things for myself internally. And you and I can follow up on that soon as well. I think that'd be a great resource for somebody somewhere to help, folks interested in the stuff track. But again, go to 2080 to see what's going on there. But also there's the target electrification pilot that's 24,194. Climate compliance plans are 2540 through 2545 or something like that. So it just requires some digging at the DPU website on that.
We have maybe just time for one quick question there. I know we have a couple minutes left, but do we have a sense with regard to these kind of hybrid cases, customers that decide to, ratepayers, homeowners that decide to retain their natural gas hookup for backup for resilience purposes, what that looks like? Do we have a sense of how many how many building owners are embracing heat pumps, but maintaining their natural gas hookups? And my understanding is that at least some of the MassSave incentives for whole home heat pump solutions require that the homeowner permanently disconnect or disable the gas hookup. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's accurate. So would love to know if you've heard about any data in that regard.
Yeah, I do know just anecdotally from some of our utilities that they are tracking usage with some of these customers there, and they're not reducing their gas demand as ideally as much as I think everyone would like on this front. And so as these systems get rolled out, we aren't yet, I think, at the point where we're having these systems well integrated enough. I mean, I actually have heat pumps in my home that they were put there in 2014. We bought the house with them with them installed, and we also have a gas boiler for the time being. And we're looking at renovating the next year or two. We'll I'm sure we'll be talking about our experience pretty widely, but I can't get these systems to interact with each other just given the way that they're designed. And believe me, it would have I thought about designing some integration here, but it was just too much work to get that done. And so we use these things on the shoulder season and are pretty much reliant on the boiler during the colder months. And that's it. But basically, we need more information on this front. And I think as the utilities get more involved in this concept of integrated energy planning, which is a process that they're going to kick off relatively soon, there'll be more discussion on this front and hopefully more insight as to where we're headed on that sort of hybrid track.
Well, that's a great way to end the conversation. Maybe a topic for a future conversation, right? How to integrate existing systems. So thank you, Mike. Really appreciate your time. Really want to thank everyone who tuned in today, all the wonderful questions. It's been a great discussion. I think we all know a lot more about neighborhood electrification. It's been a real pleasure to work with you formally in our with regard to MassCEC's project work with you. And I know our colleagues at DOER are also very happy with the work that you've done with them. So look forward to ongoing collaboration. And it's been a great conversation. Thanks so much.
All right, and thank you, Galen, for having me, and I hope everyone gets a chance to enjoy the 250th celebration this weekend.
That's
As
right.
well. Good
Right.
weather and the long weekend and all that.
Yes.
So,
Happy Patriots Day weekend, Marathon Day, so on and so forth. Yeah.
all right.
Hope it's a good one for everybody. All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Mike.
you.